Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15, 1929, in Atlanta, Georgia. In this southern city, he was born during one of the most challenging and darkest times in American history. It was a period when Black people had not yet escaped slavery and racism. Young Martin's life marked the beginning of a journey that would not only change his own life, but also the entire society. From a young age, he decided to pursue justice, equality, and peace. King's family instilled in him the importance of human rights and equality from an early age. His father, Dr. Martin Luther King Sr., was a pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta and had a significant influence in the community. Martin grew up with this deep sense of faith and justice passed down from his family. From a young age, he began facing racism and discrimination, but rather than weakening him, it strengthened his resolve and deepened his commitment to human rights. King's education laid the foundation for his fight for social change. When he entered Morehouse College in Atlanta as a young man, he began observing more closely the effects of deep segregation in the South. After completing his university studies, he went on to Crozer Theological Seminary to study theology. However, the most important transformation occurred when he decided to pursue a master's degree at Boston University in 1951. This was not only an educational journey for King, but also the beginning of a philosophical and ideological transformation. During these years, he became acquainted with Mahatma Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolent resistance. Gandhi's work on nonviolent resistance and peaceful protest in India's struggle for independence deeply influenced King's worldview. King began integrating Gandhi's ideas into his own life. He realized that nonviolent resistance not only protected personal rights, but also had the power to transform a society. Adopting this philosophy, he decided to confront the challenges Black people faced through passive resistance. This became the foundation for his future actions. Martin Luther King faced a turning point in 1955 after the arrest of Rosa Parks in Montgomery, Alabama. Rosa Parks had refused to give up her seat on a bus to a white passenger, leading to her arrest. This event sparked a movement against the discrimination faced by Black people in Montgomery. In response to this, Martin Luther King organized the Montgomery bus boycott. This boycott became a symbol of the civil rights movement in America. The purpose of the boycott was to protest the segregation on public buses. The Black residents of Montgomery refused to use the buses, effectively crippling the city's public transportation system. The boycott, which lasted for 13 months, demonstrated the courage of many civil rights leaders, including King. During this process, King realized that the pursuit of justice was not just an issue for Black people, but for all of humanity. The boycott symbolized King's emergence as not only a leader, but also a thinker, a reformer, and a champion of peace. The victory in Montgomery made King's name known across the country. However, this victory did not only make him a national hero, it also brought him face to face with powerful enemies. King and his family were constantly threatened. His home was bombed several times, but he did not lose his resolve or his faith. His leadership initiated a wave of change that affected not only Montgomery but the entire South. King's journey had become a battle not only against the discrimination in one city, but against injustice across all of America. King's struggle was not limited to defending the rights of Black people. His goal was to ensure that all people in America had equal rights. Dr. King argued that for a society to be governed by justice, all people, not just Black people, needed to have equal rights. His struggle was not just for one group of people, but for the freedom and equality of all humanity. The next step in King's journey was to further spread his efforts for nonviolent resistance and organizing the people. In 1957, Black leaders and activists came together to form the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. Under King's leadership, this organization aimed to fight segregation in many cities in the South and raise awareness in society. Through this platform, King became even more influential. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had successfully brought the Montgomery bus boycott to a victorious end, but this was just the beginning. After the boycott, King became recognized as a national hero, but in reality, this victory brought him an even greater responsibility. He was no longer just a leader for his people, but a leader for the freedom and equality of people across America. After the boycott, King's commitment to nonviolent resistance and the struggle for equality began to resonate across America. Martin Luther King was gathering strength to continue his fight against discrimination and injustice at the heart of American society. By advocating for nonviolent resistance, he accelerated his efforts to organize the people and spread peaceful protests, mobilizing citizens in many southern states. King's leadership came to represent not just the rights of Black Americans, but the fight for human rights for all Americans. He had become, in a way, the conscience of the community. But this also meant paying a great price. In his visits to southern cities and the speeches he delivered, King gave voice to the people's demand for justice and managed to awaken many. However, in return, racist leaders and police forces in the South began harboring animosity toward King. He was not only defending the rights of Black people, but was attacking the very heart of a system that went against American values. King's first major move during this period was the famous marches in Selma, Alabama, in the early 1960s. Selma was one of the most racially segregated areas, and Black people's voting rights were severely restricted. King and other civil rights activists decided to march to Selma in order to challenge this injustice and demonstrate to the entire country that they were fighting for equal rights for all. However, the situation in Selma was not an easy one to resolve. The marchers were met with violence. Police attacked them and used force against the civilians defending their rights. King and the other leaders fought relentlessly to prove once again how powerful nonviolent resistance could be in the face of such violence. This event taught a significant lesson, especially to the white people in the South. Under King's leadership, the Selma March eventually led to Congress taking action, and in 1965 the Voting Rights Act was passed. This law removed all barriers, preventing Black people from voting, effectively ending a significant dimension of segregation in America. King once again demonstrated the power of nonviolent resistance and secured an important victory for the American people. However, this victory was only the first step. King's fight had to continue. After this victory, King decided to take an even greater step toward equality and peace for all Americans. In 1963, he delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. This speech marked the height of Martin Luther King's leadership. The crowd in Washington numbered over 250,000 people, making it the largest civil rights demonstration ever held at that time. In his "I Have a Dream" speech, King expressed his struggle for equality and freedom in a peaceful and hopeful tone. He declared, "One day my children will live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character," firmly taking a stand against racism and injustice. This speech became an inspiration not only for those present but for all of America. However, Martin Luther King did not just want to change the laws. He also demanded a change in the structure and mindset of society. In his speech, he called for not only the end of racism and segregation, but also the initiation of a fight against economic inequalities. He envisioned an America that was not only a colorblind society, but also a system based on economic, social, and cultural equality. King's dream was of a society where all people, regardless of their race, had equal opportunities. After the Selma March and the speech in Washington, King's struggle quickly spread. He was now a leader seeking equality and justice not only for Black Americans, but for all people in America. However, this fight carried significant risks both for the national transformation it called for and personally for King. King had dedicated his life to this cause, and knowingly facing threats, he decided to take another step. During this time, King also began raising his voice against the Vietnam War. He believed the war was making life even harder for poor Black Americans. The majority of the soldiers sent to Vietnam were poor Black Americans, and King argued that the war deepened the inequalities within America. This made him not only a leader of the civil rights movement, but also a figure fighting for social justice. King's influence began to extend beyond just one community. His voice was raised not only for America, but for all of humanity. However, this transformation process began to exact a heavy toll on him. King's struggle threatened those in power in America, and there was growing hostility against him. Yet, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. continued to fight for peace and equality, no matter the cost. Martin Luther King Jr.'s journey, though filled with victories, was also shaped by great sacrifices and challenges. One of King's greatest triumphs was the passing of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, which marked a significant turning point in ending discrimination against Black Americans. However, these legal gains did not just change the societal structure, but also made King's life even more dangerous. Some segments of society, particularly white racists in the South, saw King's leadership in the civil rights movement as a threat. Despite these legal changes, King was still unable to completely eliminate the discrimination and inequality that were part of Black Americans' lives. In some cities in the South, police violence and the oppression of Black people by whites continued. This situation pushed King to take further action. He understood that real equality could not be achieved solely through laws. The entire structure of society and the mindset of the people needed to change. For this, not only nonviolent protests would be necessary, but also a cultural transformation. King, in his fight for equality and justice, drew attention particularly in 1966 during his visit to Chicago. This visit provided him with a deeper perspective on economic inequalities in America. King realized that the battle was not just against racism, but also against poverty and economic inequality. In 1968, he launched the Poor People's Campaign, officially announcing his fight against economic inequality and poverty. However, this movement faced an even more complex and difficult barrier than the deep-rooted racism in the South. King's experiences in Chicago exposed a broader social justice problem that was not limited to white people excluding Black people. The poverty, health issues, and lack of education experienced by Black people in the working-class neighborhoods of the city showed how complicated social problems could be. King called on the public not only to rise against the racist attitudes of whites but also against the inequality caused by the capitalist system. This earned him broad public support, but also opposition from many people who sought Black freedom. However, King's greatest challenge was not only dealing with violence and racism in the South but also constant threats and attacks. By 1967, some around King argued that his opposition to the Vietnam War should receive more attention for the sake of Black rights and freedoms. King claimed that the war deepened the divide between poor Black and white Americans, and that the Vietnam War was in fact the greatest enemy of the American people and state. King's stance on the war was criticized by many Americans and even some civil rights advocates. This was a risky position for a Black leader in the political climate of the time. But King, contrary to his country's policies, chose to oppose the war in the name of peace and human rights. His opposition to the war and his struggle against economic inequality brought him into confrontation not only with white racists, but also with America's most powerful political and economic forces. As King's voice rose in every area, threats against him increased. The FBI continued to monitor King's movement. Not only did King defend Black rights, but as a leader who questioned the state's policies and operations, he was seriously threatened, and these threats sometimes escalated into violence. The FBI's attempt to label King as a communist or a threat was not only an attack on him, but also a smear campaign against the entire movement. However, despite these threats and difficulties, Martin Luther King Jr. continued his struggle without pause. His speeches against the war and inequality began to resonate not just for change in America, but around the world. However, the increasing difficulties made King's life even more dangerous. By the end of 1967, King planned to organize another march to mobilize the people once again. This march would not just be a civil rights demonstration, but also a call for peace, equality, and human rights to the entire world. However, this call would also create much greater dangers for him. King's costly struggle was not only putting his people at risk, but also placing himself in great danger. His visit to Memphis, Tennessee in 1968 would be one of the most difficult moments in his final years. King was planning to speak in support of the striking sanitation workers in his hometown. After this speech, the final step would be taken to threaten his leadership and the rights he stood for. King was a target, and soon, on April 4, 1968, he was assassinated by James Earl Ray. King's death deeply shocked America. He was not just a leader, but the hope and future of his people. After his death, riots erupted in many cities. However, his legacy lived on, changing the social fabric of America, inspiring the global struggle for human rights and continuing to inspire the fight for freedom worldwide. Martin Luther King Jr. will forever be remembered as a leader who fought for the freedom of not only Black people but all of humanity. After Martin Luther King Jr.'s death, a void was created in the United States. King symbolized the fight for equality, peace, and justice not only for Black people but for all of humanity. His life carried the marks of a leader who united his people and instilled hope in them. However, filling this vast void after his death would not be easy. King's legacy was not just based on his death, but also on the revolutionary changes he left behind. His struggle continued to inspire the global pursuit of social justice. After King's death, Black Americans and all civil rights advocates went through a deep trauma. The rights they had fought so long and hard for, the victories they had achieved under King's leadership, now seemed like an empty dream. However, King's death did not mark the end of the movement. He continued to live in the hearts of his people, and his ideals were adopted by many who wished to see his dreams come true. After King's passing, there was a leadership vacuum. However, there were figures who could fill this gap. King's allies, his family, and other prominent figures of the movement continued to carry on his legacy. King's wife, Coretta Scott King, especially after the assassination in 1968, became one of the most important voices in the civil rights struggle. Coretta worked to carry on her husband's work, while also striving to continue his fight against violence and racism. In the 1970s, Coretta Scott King fought to expand Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy in education, peace, and equality. After King's death, the public not only remembered him but also continued to embrace his ideals. The civil rights movement that began in the 1960s carried on into the 1970s and beyond. However, the violence and discrimination King faced during his time made this struggle even more difficult. After 1968, the fight against racism continued not only in the South but across all of America. Major anti-discrimination protests took place in cities like Chicago and Detroit. These protests often faced police violence, and the public, following King's example, continued to show nonviolent resistance. However, the movements during the time of King's death were not only against racism. Starting in the late 1960s, Black people and other minorities began to question economic inequality and poverty. Movements like the Poor People's Campaign demanded not only racial equality, but also economic justice. Poverty was a nationwide issue in America, and King addressed this as well. He argued that not only Black people but all citizens needed to unite against economic inequality. Though he passed away in 1968, the fight against economic inequality became an important part of his legacy. The memorial services held after King's death were significant steps in preserving his legacy. In 1983, Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, January 15th, was declared a national holiday in the United States. This decision symbolized the country's acceptance of King's struggle and the love the people had for him. However, remembering King with just one day was insufficient to truly reflect his fight. Therefore, the preservation of King's legacy became stronger with annual memorial events and speeches. After King's death, significant changes began to take place in the social structure. The major social movements of the 1960s and 1970s brought gains for Black Americans. After the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were officially approved, the quality of life for Black people, particularly in the southern states, began to improve in the 1980s and 1990s. However, social inequality had not disappeared entirely. King's view that racism is not over, it just continues in more subtle forms, remained valid during this period. King's legacy was not limited to America. His message of equality and peace resonated worldwide. In the 1960s, anti-apartheid movements in South Africa were inspired by King's fighting spirit. Nelson Mandela, inspired by King's life, fought for the freedom of his people for many years. Mandela adopted King's philosophy of nonviolent resistance and led the resistance against apartheid in South Africa. The civil rights and freedom movements in America influenced people worldwide, sparking a global wave for freedom. King's legacy continues to live on in the 21st century. Today, he is remembered as the pioneer of nonviolent resistance and peace in America. The struggle against racism and discrimination in society remains an issue that concerns not only the Black community, but all Americans. Martin Luther King Jr. gained even more respect after his death, but the truth remained that his struggle was not over. It was only in the midst of a revolution. The legacy left behind by Martin Luther King Jr. was particularly evident in the social structures of the 1970s and 1980s. King had united the people with his advocacy for nonviolent resistance and the fight for equality. But there were still major obstacles to achieving his dream. King's philosophy of "we are in this together, we are connected" not only initiated great changes among the people, but also within the country's structure. However, more effort was needed for this change to be fully realized. Throughout his life, King symbolized the fight for equality and freedom for Black Americans and all minorities. However, after his death, the question of whether this struggle had been completed remained unanswered. After King's death, the demand for equality among Black Americans continued, but the social structure needed deep changes. King knew that true equality could not be achieved without changing the economic, cultural, and political structure of society. Therefore, his fight was not only against racism, but also against economic injustice and class-based discrimination. King made the fight against poverty a priority for all of America, not just Black Americans. During this period, the economic situation of Black Americans was still very difficult. Although the civil rights movement, which began in the 1960s, brought racial equality and legal rights, economic inequality persisted. King had argued that the public should demand not only legal equality, but also equal rights in terms of living standards. The Poor People's Campaign, which he launched in 1968, was a call for millions of Americans to achieve better living conditions. However, after King's death, the direction and strength of this movement depended on how determined the leaders who followed him were. Coretta Scott King continued to uphold Martin Luther King Jr.'s ideals. The King Center, which she founded to defend her husband's legacy, became a center for peace and justice not only in America but globally. Coretta continued the struggle for equality, racial peace, and economic justice that King had championed. Her leadership in the women's rights and anti-poverty movements played an important role in fostering social change. After King's death, improvements were made in the living conditions of Black Americans, but major obstacles still remained. In many southern states, racism had become an entrenched system, and Black people continued to face discrimination. There were still significant divisions in education, the workforce, and government offices. The complete equality of Black and white people in education and economic opportunities remained a subject of struggle for many years. However, during this period, another important effort for social change gained strength with the influence of American media. Starting in the early 1970s with the rise of television, social justice demands reached a wider audience. After King's death and the violent protests that followed, Americans began to recognize the power of nonviolent resistance. This period marked the beginning of a time when King's ideals truly took root, especially among the younger generation. 2. Civil rights movement gained a new dimension, especially towards the end of the 1970s. Social media and mass communication became powerful tools for societal change. Following in King's footsteps, people continued the fight for racial equality and justice. However, this was not just a struggle limited to America. It became a global fight for equality, connecting with movements such as the anti-apartheid efforts in South Africa, labor rights defenders in Latin America, and minority rights movements in Asia. King's message after his death resonated not just in America but around the world. Despite these global strides, by the end of the 1980s, America still faced significant racial and economic inequality. Years after Martin Luther King Jr.'s death, the struggle against racism continued. In the 1980s and 1990s, while there were gains for Black Americans, deeper and more extensive changes were still necessary. King's words, "In my dream, my children will live in a world where they are judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character," still echoed. During this time, two significant events occurred that would accelerate societal change. The first was the 1989 large-scale racial violence in Los Angeles, followed by the 1992 beating of Rodney King by police, both of which led to nationwide protests. Black Americans responded more strongly to these events, and a movement against police brutality and racism gained even more momentum. These protests grew into a large anti-racism social movement that persisted throughout the 1990s. King's legacy continued to live on during this period. Throughout the 1990s, Black Americans and other minorities were able to voice their concerns more powerfully. Major steps were taken toward racial equality in society, but the fight was far from over, and it remained clear that the struggle would continue until full equality was achieved. King's fight, during his lifetime, was not only about achieving equality and rights for Black Americans, but also about transforming the entire social fabric, values, and understandings of America. By uniting the people, King had demonstrated the power of nonviolent resistance while advocating for equal rights for all humanity, regardless of race, color, or culture. However, these ideals would require a long, drawn-out process and deep change. This struggle continued even after King's death, though there were still significant obstacles. Black Americans still faced major inequalities in education, healthcare, and the workforce. To truly realize King's dream, many more generations would need to be part of this struggle. The 1980s and 1990s saw more opportunities opening up for Black Americans, but racism still ran deep within society. King's fight, however, had become more understood as not just against racism, but also against economic inequality. King had said, "A person should not be judged by the color of their skin, but should live with equal opportunities and rights." Over time, this philosophy was embraced by more people, and in major American cities like New York and Los Angeles, economic opportunities for Black Americans began to increase. However, despite these developments, the traces of racism had not been fully erased. The Rodney King incident in 1992 led to a massive social upheaval in America. King was beaten by the police and killed, but when the officers were acquitted, it triggered widespread protests and a major societal movement against racism. These events gave new strength to King's dream, signaling the start of a new era in the fight against racism across America. In the wake of the Rodney King incident by the mid-1990s, the fight against economic inequality and racism in America had taken on a new dimension. During the administration of President Bill Clinton, important steps such as the Welfare Reform Act were taken in the early 1990s. However, Black Americans and other minority groups still faced inequality in many areas. These deep societal divisions led to racial inequality becoming a pervasive social, economic, and political issue. King's belief that equality should be for all of humanity, not just one part of society, continued to shape public consciousness. Although progress had been made in society, much remained to be done after King's death to achieve societal peace. This process would not only be driven by the increase in economic opportunities, but also by the elimination of racial prejudices within society. Throughout the 1990s, America increasingly embraced King's philosophy of nonviolent resistance and his calls for social peace. King's dream had evolved into an ideal not only for Black Americans, but for the entire world. Despite America continuing to struggle with violence and racism, nonviolent protests and civil disobedience strategies still played a vital role in preserving King's legacy. During this period, the significance of King's role in society became clearer, and he became a symbol of peace and equality. In an effort to share King's vision with more people, educational programs were organized in schools and universities. Martin Luther King Jr. Day began to be celebrated as a holiday in many cities. This was a significant step, not just for Black Americans, but for all Americans to honor the struggle for equality and peace. These celebrations reflected the deep and far-reaching impact of King's legacy. King's life, even years after his death, continued to be a beacon for social change and the fight for equality. By the early 2000s, important developments took place in America's anti-racism movements, equality in the workforce, and the defense of minority rights. Every step taken toward a world based on King's ideals was another crucial step toward realizing that dream. Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy became a force that changed the world after his death. Although racial inequalities still persisted in society, the struggles for equality that he dreamed of continued to unfold as part of a historical journey. His words and actions turned into a global movement, laying the foundation for struggles for peace, justice, and equality not just in America but around the world. In conclusion, Martin Luther King Jr.'s great dream of achieving peace and equality through nonviolence revolutionized America's social structure. This revolution was just the beginning of the battles for a more just, equal, and tolerant world. King's dream continued to resonate in these lands, and each generation demonstrated its respect for him by continuing the fight for equality.